Hello, very beautiful community. I'm sorry to be late. I'm having a little bit of a health crisis, but I hope I can talk with you and that it doesn't escalate. I'm struggling a little bit to breathe, and I've got a pain resonating to my jaw, which is always something to be aware about, beautiful community. Let me try to have a go at taking your questions and give me a little bit of help if you can see and hear me. Hey, Vlad, could you comment on Trump complimenting Zelensky? Trump can be blasted out of his conception of Zelensky, which is that Zelensky is really a person who doesn't properly exist in Trump's narcissistic society into which he fantasizes himself and Putin and Netanyahu and others. As Ukraine does better, it will be possible for Trump to moderate some of this attitude to Zelensky, but it can't completely change because basically he regards Zelensky as a sort of aesthetically unpalatable incursion into international affairs that stops things going the way he would like them to go. So I wouldn't make much of it yet, is basically what I would say. What would it look like, New25, to see Russia actually developing a willingness to end the war? It would be about getting inside Putin's head, number one. Number two, it would be about understanding how much in Putin's head and functionally this is a defensive war for Putin's regime. You mentioned, Paul is saying Crimean annexation would only be legitimate if it were done in two steps. It's not obvious to me what you're talking about. Please expand. So when we're talking about a bit of a country leaving to become a part of another country, that brings together two things that are already massive democratic decisions. So imagine Norfolk wanting to join Denmark. It would need to first secede, have a conversation with itself as a self-contained polity about what it is and what direction it wants to go in. It couldn't do that before leaving the UK. Only then could it decide to join Denmark in a way that would persuade enough people. You're beginning to get it, right? It's already an extraordinary thing to secede. You don't want to pair that with joining another country. It's not going to look legitimate. It's not going to feel legitimate because you're conflating two decisions, one about independence from the country of which you're historically a part, the other is about joining a completely different country. Psittaca's thumbnail title feels like a test. Vlad spent years pointing out he'd have many more views trading on the emotional appeal of claims about Putin, Russian weakness, and imminent failure. Yeah, well, it's not going to be helped by a random live, but we do have a situation where arguably Putin is doing worse than he has done since late 2022. Ross, Peter Baker, average life expectancy of a Russian recruit, according to Peter Baker, the New York Times, is somewhere between 10 days and 3 weeks. How long can this be sustained? For general pressure or perpetuation of the war of some kind, very, very long. For very, very highly intense warfare predicated on making advances, not so long. I mean, this takes us to a question about mobilization, and people are going to ask that. I'll try to do it now, beautiful community. I bet a question about mobilization will come up, so we'll take it then. Dane, I think we need big question philosophy again. Existentialists feel too heavy, postmodernists too pointless. Where is the next movement with potential broad appeal? You can't predict these things. And to a certain extent, there are social forces mitigating against there being movements that pick a lot of people up. Our biggest movements are very consumerist, depoliticized, and a commercial version of Stoicism is probably the best example of a movement of any kind in the West. The most successful movements in the West right now are anti-democratic, authoritarian, fascicized movements. They're successful because they understand better than most of you do the ways in which liberal democracy has ground to a halt and has run into corners that it can't properly negotiate. So it's the destructive, irresponsible charlatans in our politics who have got slightly clearer vision about the unsustainability about certain modes of politics, which is why they're winning, and they're going to continue to win. An alternative to that would be really a reimagination of liberal democracy that is compatible with the social forces at hand and also compatible with the various kinds of malaises of modernity and the nature of modern disenchantment. What's your opinion on the UK rejoining the EU, expanding the EU, and a federal EU? They are all moves that to different extents run against the winds of history. So they're only moves that are possible if we can gain greater control over the social forces that are making these moves be moves against the winds of history. Vlad, what are your arguments against pacifists who argue Europe shouldn't engage in an arm race and shouldn't prolong the Ukraine war? Well, if these are people who are real pacifists, then you have to get to a conclusion that shows that there are extremely strong arguments against pacifism, to put it mildly, while pacifism is, of course, an ethically respectable position to take. Human beings engage in conflict of various kinds. Human beings are violent. Are violent because we are strange kinds of animals who live under culture is inflected by deep, profoundly deep cultural difference, which doesn't make us less violent than lions and tigers. It just means that our violence is organized differently. It is organized like you would expect it to be organized for animals whose most remarkable evolutionary achievement is that they live under culture. Eventually, from what I've just said, you're going to get to a conclusion that says that human beings are going to need to take seriously the idea that you sometimes need to engage in violence to defend yourself against other violent human beings. But that's the abstract position. The practical position is actually that a lot of what you're talking about is a mode of left-wing or ex-left politics that is about the idea that you just start at home, right? You focus on your own faults first before you start declaring what are the faults of the Russian Empire and trying to militarily resist them. Do you consider cultural and sporting organizations turning a blind eye to Russia's atrocities and claiming that arts and sports are not politics to be a significant problem? No, it's obviously not a significant problem. Is it a problem? Well, in sports, yes, although Russia's been banned from all kinds of things, and obviously Russia is banned from football. It's not at the World Cup and didn't participate in the qualification. So I think there are pretty good reasons to ban Russia from sporting events. There are arguments against it, but pretty good reasons for it. Arts, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know exactly what you mean, so I'm not sure I can answer that. Obviously, we don't want to be associated with some kind of art pushed by the Russian state. That's a mode of propaganda for the regime. So that's not good at all. On the other hand, if somebody's having a conference on Turgenev and Dostoevsky, then there's no problem with that, obviously, at all, any more than there's a problem with having a conference on Dickens. Vlad, could you give a big picture update of your health? I have done in the last few months on the Vlad's ME Diary channel. I might do a long form Q&A on my health, either on that channel or even here. But in just a nutshell, it's a year and a half since I lost the ability to walk. And I've got about half an hour in the wheelchair every day, sometimes a lot more, but that's rare. But I can control for that to some degree. So I sometimes can control for longer wheelchair times. So my life has been completely transformed over the last year and a half. And I am 90, sort of probably 97% bed bound, but not horizontal. My legs are stretched out, but I'm like this. It's a lot less violent than it used to be a year ago, but it's still pretty violent. Like, I often get these beautiful walls of messages. Vlad, I'm so glad you're looking so well. Glad you're better. But in fact, I'm going through all kinds of hellish crises in between my lovely chats. Super thanks. Hey Vlad, DJ is asking how God-fearing is Putin. Putin is basically secular, but he's very mystically minded, but is not religious. With the depoliticized population, Too Much Mushrooms is asking, why does enforced social conservatism like being against LGBT rights, abortion, limitations, and promotion of orthodoxy? Are these his personal views? Sorry, that's not making sense to me, maybe because I'm not feeling well. No, Putin is not particularly conservative socially relative to Russians of his generation. He's probably less socially conservative than them, but these things pay for the regime, and the regime also needs to find internal enemies, and the regime will continue finding ever greater numbers of internal enemies, I'm afraid, right? So that's why there are certain groups, certain minority groups in Russia, for whom the advice might be, if you can, run. Any thoughts on a provocation on the eastern flank of the EU coming soon from Russia? Ollie. Putin is in a difficult moment. He's in a difficult moment in Crimea. He's in a difficult moment on the front line. He's not making progress. He's in a difficult moment with the impact of Ukrainian strikes on Russian territory. He's in trouble with the fuel crisis. His economy is heading downward. And there's a very, very low level of agitated fatigue, both in parts of the population and in parts of the elites, but it remains depoliticized. Putin has some possibilities for response or escalation. What are they? One is a tactical nuclear strike on NATO. I would regard that as very unlikely. Another is a mobilization. there is absolutely activated talk in the regime about mobilization now. The Ukrainians assure us that actually, given the nature of the uh, balance of the various weapon systems in play and the fact that this is a drone war to such a great extent, a mobilization won't help Putin as much as he might think. But that is absolutely an active topic, but no decision has been made, and it's something Putin is going to try to be very conservative about. Then there are technical solutions. Can Russia come up with certain things, maybe in the realm of drone technology, that can rebalance things that seem to be going in Ukraine's favor at the moment? So, one of these scenarios is some kind of very low threshold and minimal intervention in the Baltics. And the idea would be to try to use the Baltics as a kind of Iran's Hormuz. Hey guys, we've done something very limited. If you don't want to see more of this, please stop supporting Ukraine. If I were an evil advisor to Putin, and maybe I could do a separate talk about this, I would be recommending this within the next, let's say, year or two. Putin is very risk averse and conservative. And he certainly doesn't want to do this. If he did do it, and there is a realistic chance that he could, why would he do it? He would do it because he is fighting a defensive war, and he'd come to regard it as a necessary uh, defensive step. No, he wouldn't have to mobilize user GK saying to do anything in the Baltics because he doesn't have an interest in invading the Baltics, really. As part of that hypothetical scenario, all that needs to happen is what I'm saying is not reality, it's just bullshit. But there's going to be a military account of the bullshit that I put there just as a placeholder. So here's the bullshit. He's just going to need to lob a few missiles over at the Baltics. And then he's going to say, well, you're not going to do anything about it, are you? And now your little Article 5 has been challenged. Or has it? Does anyone know even what it is? Does anyone even know if anybody's committed to it? And hasn't this revealed that, of course, not just the United States, but Western powers have no interest in activating themselves in the Baltics? So, what if Putin killed some NATO, non-Baltic NATO soldiers in the Baltics, but then just stopped? Or what if Putin launched a couple of rockets and none of them hit their target, or they got intercepted or something like that, right? So you've got to build up via a little bit of military expertise, right? That's not available on these channels, on my channels. And then that would fill out that box that I'm giving you, but it's a box because I'm giving it to you politically. There are a lot of wonderful reports saying about how perfectly protected the Baltics are from a Russian invasion, that a lot of regional experts delight in sharing. They're a little bit bogus because they are true as far as they go. But what they misunderstand is how politically motivated rather than military success motivated that attack would be by Putin. So it's something we absolutely have to be prepared for. It's not something that we are safe from just because all kinds of nice reports say that the Baltics are well prepared and that there's a regional military response that's ready to go. I'm afraid that underestimates what and why Putin might do what he might do. He's a little fizzle, Vlad, wish you good health. Thank you so much. Hey, Vlad, can you please say more about why you think nobody in Putin's inner circle would have started a full-scale invasion? There's no chance that Patrushev would have started a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Maybe somebody like Mr. Kovalchuk could have started an invasion, but he's somebody who Putin had a degree of contact with during the early years of the public health crisis, and he has spectacularly hawkish and somewhat mystical views. But as far as the constituency of the Security Council at that time, no, I can't think of a single member who would have done it, although plenty would have done something. But a full-scale invasion, I think, is Putin's enterprise. I think the reservations would have been about fear of consequence and escalation, worry about the success of the operation, an absence of various kinds of paranoid visions of the degree to which Putin has them. They are paranoid too, but not quite to that degree. In all of their cases, although Patrushev is paranoid. They would have been concerned about consequences domestically for Russia for a host of reasons. There isn't a single person I'd be confident about saying that they would have done it, and it's very unlikely, in my assessment, that Patrushev would have wanted a full-scale invasion of Ukraine if Putin just vanished and Patrushev became president. And also, these people are incredibly passive and cowardly, for the most part. So, on a range of factors, it's hard to see it. Would a sudden invasion of Russia by a NATO power actually quickly succeed? It depends what kind of invasion. If it's the kind of invasion Ukraine did already in the Kursk Oblast, then yeah, that could succeed. If you're talking about a full-scale invasion of Russia with a march on Moscow, there'd be a good chance that that would kill you wherever you are in the world. Maybe not if you're in New Zealand. Do I think that Putin will succeed drawing Belarus into the war? In the maximalist sense of it, our answer for now should be no. In some more minimal sense, our answer could be yes. Michelle is saying Putin wrote about being cornered by a rat, cornering a rat when he was a child, which then attacked him in order to survive. What does this say about his thought process? Putin has a traumatic childhood, and I think that his childhood and his Petersburg experiences are in many ways more formative than his KGB experiences. Putin is not a typical KGB operative, right? That's just stuff you hear on, you don't hear it on the better quality, but you do hear it on the less good quality, what used to be Times Radio interviews. Now that main Times Radio channel has become the Trump Report, I think. Why do you see in such strongly neoliberal societies as the USA and Russia, citizens who are so exercised about their neighbors not living their personal lives in the way they agree with? You don't have that much of that in Russia. You really don't. Propaganda pushes this, but and of course, Russians, when they clash with one another, get triggered, right? When there is road rage in the United States, you're going to basically see people saying to each other, I'm going to punch you in the face. You're this, you're that. In Russia, it's going to be more visceral a lot of the time. People are going to say to each other, they're going to tear one another's limbs off, and that the other person in the road rage incident is going to crawl limbless across the earth. This is going to be that kind of dark. There's a lot of darkness that is ready to snap out of the minds of Russians, more so than in the West. There is that. There is the propaganda effort, but broadly speaking, with Russians, I would say they largely don't care what their neighbors do. So I think as a generalization about Russians, it's not true. It's much truer about Americans. Because in the United States, you've got both this kind of spectacularly sort of intellectually random in its principles, religious right or religious X right. And then on top of that, you've also got a receding wave of hyper-identity politics in the center. Neither of these two things are present in Russia. Now, can wanting to tell other people what to do be a form of neoliberalism? Yeah, sure, right? Hyper-identity politics is that to an extent, right? It's a way of ignoring class, ignoring central features of disadvantage, and converting conversations about central features of disadvantage into squabbling in narrow elite language, in narrow elite institutions, between narrow elites. That's neoliberalism, right? Because in many ways, hyper-identity politics movements thinking of themselves as challenging the status quo reinforce the status quo much more than they challenge it, right? That's partly why we need to urgently reset, talk about disadvantage toward values like solidarity and away from values like sort of epistemically impenetrable and unique group identity. Do you downplay the neurodiversity of people like Putin and Assad? No, Putin is not on the spectrum in my view. Both are heartless dictators. No, being neurodivergent is a very, very distinct presentation. You can't just derive it from a few generally human traits, negative or positive. It reminds me, Brian says, of Saddam launching scuds at Israel in Desert Storm 1. Well, let me tell you a bit about that. So when I arrived in Israel in 1990, the Soviet Union still existed. And I arrived there with my family, my parents and my younger sister. My sister's younger than me by about 8 or 9 years. She's almost 40. No, she isn't. She's still got a couple of years to go. But we took a train from Moscow to Budapest, and then a plane ride, an El Al jumbo jet to Tel Aviv. And it was quite extraordinary arriving because I'd never seen so much color in my life before. Advertisements were beginning to appear in the Soviet Union, but Soviet cities were still dark at night. And there's this unbelievable city glowing with light beneath the plane. It was very exciting. The plane also got a military jet escort for a bit of the flight. And then when we arrived, there were all of these Israelis welcoming us, more Israelis welcoming us, and a number of people on the flight and giving presents, like mountains of presents that it would take you sort of months to get through, candies, chocolates, and so on. And so it felt like a very exciting experiment. It was supposed to be, it failed at that. It was supposed to be an experiment in blood and belonging. In reality, it was Russians escaping bad economic conditions, Soviets escaping bad economic conditions in Russia in Kazakhstan and Ukraine and going to Israel, wherever they were from. And then as soon as we arrived, lived in very limited circumstances, sharing a 2-bedroom apartment with another family. So 4 people on the floor for a while without any beds. And then the Gulf War started and there was no school for me. And at that point, I had an extremely romantic idea of the West that applied to Israel, but much more than to Israel, to Europe and the United States. In the late 80s, we over-idealized the West. As a child, I thought that there were no problems in the West, and that in fact, Westerners had no internal problems. They were psychologically resolved. Maybe by the age of about 9, I didn't think that anymore, but sort of age 7, I did. And my greatest, most fun activity, arguably, was going through German catalogs, toy catalogs, and catalogs with various kinds of goods. It was just unbelievable, like a completely different civilization. And so the Gulf War started. And retrospectively, it was, extremely safe. I mean, a friend of mine was on the other side, a friend I were to meet later. He actually escaped Iraq during the first Gulf War, but he was on the other side. And we lived together for a while, actually, when I was at university. And of course, it was a completely different experience. It was much closer to a computer game being in Israel. People were concerned about chemical warfare, and so we were putting on gas masks every night for an hour during air raid sirens. There was a Patriot system really close to the apartment block, which meant that you'd hear the Patriot going off first before the air raid siren often. And I saw an interception with my eyes. I was standing out of the window, and this SS-1 ancient Soviet Scud ballistic missile seemed to have got intercepted by a Patriot. There was an explosion, and the glass through which I was looking at the sky cracked. And I experienced all of this with a kind of exhilaration at Western supremacy and the resplendence of American air. 9-year-old boy, please come on. A resplendence of American air power. It felt like the kind of the negotiation of the world, the solving of political problems by people, by techniques that were so technologically advanced that they made a computer game out of the world's problems. That's my child's experience of the first Gulf War in Israel. Chester is doing a Trump impression. Thank you for your Trump impression. It's very strong. What do you think of Mamdani as an alternative? Let's focus on Russia. But I'll take 30 seconds on this. As an alternative to technocratic liberals, he is an alternative to technocratic liberals. He's communicating in just the right way. Jumping in the pool, just the right thing to do as well. But the question is, how far is he going to run into actually not being able to deliver on the key things he's promised eventually and generate disillusionment? So we're going to see. What he has successfully done so far, his greatest achievement so far, is that he has created the impression that he's governing. That's incredibly important in contemporary politics. So whether he fails or succeeds or something in the middle, there's a lot to take from what he is doing to incorporate into what would be our ideal politician. Gen Consensus says the Russian economy is controlled by an authoritarian mafia that's not neoliberal. Neoliberalism as I argue, as Wendy Brown in a very different way also argues. She's a political theorist. Neoliberalism leads to hyper-neoliberalism. I will elaborate on this now, but Russia is a radically neoliberal society, but also a radically hyper-neoliberal society. I won't re-legislate this because I've elaborated these definitions in recent main channel videos. The rigorist, always happy to see you on Sunday. Happy to be with you. The Lunin guy you made a video about yesterday already got arrested. Well, I think I said that his wife thought that he might have already been arrested, even in the video. So that was coming. Have we in the West become a bit like the Vlad of 9 years ago? A bit, right? Because part of my fantasies about the West were kind of about depoliticization, right? My fantasy of the West was not coherent. I thought of it as one big thing and one thing that's in its magical way solved all its problems. And when I first got to Israel, and I immediately faced many different kinds of disillusionment, I then went on to think, well, maybe Israel is halfway step to the West, and then the next country, maybe Canada or UK, will be really the West. And then I arrived in the UK in 1994, and by accident, I ended up in one of the most disadvantaged schools in the country, a school that specialized in kids with mental disabilities, but also in kids who got expelled from other schools for violence. And it was such a ground and pound, as Joe Rogan would say, experience my first year there that I didn't even learn English much. So I arrived in England saying, I had some salad and potato. And I kept saying that a year later. Weirdly, because I learned these basic English words in Israel, I spoke with an American accent when I first came here in 1994, because of course Israelis speak with an American accent. So I came here saying, obviously I can't do it now, saying all these simple sentences with an American accent. So it was a year and a half later that I walked into a bookshop and bought a book by Isaiah Berlin and then devoured it and learned English from it. And I started using words from it without even understanding what they were. And I started using words from Isaiah Berlin's lectures without understanding what they were. And it took me years to actually correct some of that. I thought that unimpeachable was unimpeachable. And there are many words that I misuse like that. And so my vocabulary ran far ahead of my comprehension. But I got there eventually, and then very quickly, English became the language in which I thought, because when I first got to the UK, I talked in Hebrew. That was my preferred language, not Russian. So think about how long ago Russian was the language that I preferred to primarily use in my daily life. When I arrived to Israel, yes. A year after being in Israel, yes. Beyond that, not sure. So kind of 1991, 1992, Russian stopped being my main operative language. Paul Pearson, has Vlad talked about the nuclear issue? Not sure. Ask a question about it if you like. Okay. Elsevier, I think there is always the chance that if Putin were to order the use of nuclear weapons, that those around him would depose him, not if it was a delimited tactical nuclear strike. If Putin wanted to start World War III, yeah, they would. He'd probably not be obeyed through the chain of command. But a very limited tactical nuclear strike of the kind that would be equivalent to the sort of conventional attack on the Baltics we were talking about, yeah, that he'd be able to do that. I don't have much doubt about that. It's good to see you smiling and healthier than a while back. Yeah, than a year and a half ago, but relative to half a year ago, up and down. Thank you so much, Phil. What would it take for Putin to use nukes, and what would happen after that? It depends what he did. I mean, the Karaganov story is that you should do a limited nuclear strike on some military facility in Poland or something. Why would Putin ever do that? I think that's very unlikely indeed. I think some kind of a conventional, very limited, very low threshold attempt to challenge Article 5 in the Baltics is much more plausible than that. Putin would only do it if he thought it was essential to the sustenance of his regime. Putin would only ever escalate radically if he felt two connected things were true. A, his regime was at risk, at imminent risk, and B, relatedly, his life was at imminent risk. He sees the two things as going together. What would happen after, I think, would be worth a separate conversation. However, I would probably say that it wouldn't be pretty what would happen after. In other words, you would likely be very disappointed in the response of the West if Putin did a limited tactical nuclear strike on a NATO military base. But it's, in my assessment, extremely unlikely. Hey, Vlad, what could be the future outlook going forward for Russia's neighboring countries such as Georgia? There's a lot of anxiety here regarding future prospects. Georgia is on a very different path of negotiating with Russian imperialism to Ukraine. Ukraine's position is a position of resistance. The Georgian position is a position of aversion and co-option at the same time, a balance. Basically, that creates a tragic situation whereby you are politically dependent on what happens inside Russia's borders. You're politically dependent on basically waiting out the collapse of the Putin regime. The good news is that it will collapse. The bad news is that it might not happen anytime soon. And there is no way to break that dependence. Do you think Putin has the same structural restrictions around him that Trump has that slowed down his limited impulse to use nuclear weapons? No, nowhere near as much. It will be incomparably harder for Trump to try to set off a tactical nuclear weapon than it would be for Putin. There's clearly restrictions, but they're not comparable. Did you say Zelensky regime on purpose? And if so, why did you pick those words? No, I didn't. That just came out. I could have used it to talk about the democratic deficit of the Zelensky administration regime, but I didn't say that word. I just meant to say administration and said regime because I've been saying the Putin regime. Do you think universalism principles need to be jettisoned for the sake of liberal democracy? We don't need our principles to be universal. We don't need them to apply to the time of Ivan the Terrible or Henry VIII. What we do, however, need is for our principles to have a degree of normative purchase in the world in which we find ourselves. So if the first thing is the kind of universalism you're talking about, we don't need it. If the second thing is the universalism you're talking about, we certainly do need it. There is no way to say that democracy is a good idea in the UK, but it doesn't really apply or work for some other countries for cultural reasons. There are going to be very different cultural inflections of democratic life. There are also going to be obstacles that prevent democratic life in much of the world. But that doesn't mean that there aren't strong arguments that actually are valid for all humans on Earth today about wanting to have some kind of say over what their government does, about wanting to have some kind of say over what happens in the courts, right? It's not a cultural preference to have courts that are rigged against you if you end up in the court system, right? So we've got to be realistic actually about how some of the things we're committed to are compelling for all human beings on the planet. I mean, are there really Chinese people who are interested in not having a fair trial? As soon as you begin talking about it, what turns out to be the case is that certain very minimal things you associate with liberal democracy are, as it were, hard to detach from the reasonable aspirations of any modern human being. That's not a Fukuyamian thesis. It's just a thesis that says that certain conceptions of legitimacy are hard to resist in the modern world. Why is there such a strong discrepancy in the perception of Zelensky among Ukraine supporters? Are the enchanted by Zelensky blinded by the circumstances he is in, or is it the charisma? I think that Ukrainians have very different views about Zelensky. I mean, they also would have very different views about Zelensky if the war stopped. What I'd say about Westerners is that Western supporters of Ukraine tend to support Ukraine through the prism of their ideas about what it means to be a patriot in their own country. And therefore, the views people have of Ukrainian politics are not very well grounded generally. And one of the points I make repeatedly is that most Western Ukraine supporters actually know more about Russian politics than Ukraine's politics, right? And so even for figures who have been much more in the international news in recent months, like Mr. Yermak, for example, even with people like that, I bet people in this room would know more about, I don't know, Patrushev than Yermak. So I think that in the case of most support for Ukraine, it just doesn't go with deep immersion in Ukrainian politics. And so what we make of Ukrainian politics tends to be read off of English speaking, English language, Western facing speeches that Zelensky makes. And that means you can actually deduce certain qualities about Zelensky, right? Like you can just see there was a remarkable decision of his not to leave, not to run. So you do know enough to see that that's remarkable, but you don't know enough to exactly understand what kind of character he is, how trustworthy he is, how he would relate to his friends, what his relationship is with the corruption in Ukraine. So, and I'm not saying there's a fault here, but I'm saying that there is a certain kind of a domestic prism through which most people experience their support for Ukraine. I mean, think about most of the English language pro-Ukraine channels. They are tendentiously activist channels which tend to sort of start with ideas like, I'm from country X, and as a patriot of country X, it's a good idea to support Ukraine. Do you think it's likely Putin uses, Alona is asking, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine before the war is over? I'd say it's unlikely, but I couldn't rule it out. But I would say it's unlikely as things stand. Boris, great question about Australia. I'm gonna probably need to catch up more with recent Australian politics to say more. I used to live in Australia, and so I feel that I've been too much out of touch recently for health reasons. I mean, I know who the characters are, but I want a little bit more freshness in my remarks. Acting is not about pretending, Cam Norwood is saying. It's about opening up and being yourself in those circumstances. If you're talking about Zelensky in the early parts of the war, what was actually happening with Zelensky was that he was becoming himself. So he evolved a lot. He was, in many ways, a different person 2 weeks into the war than he was before the full-scale invasion. Now, you might say, isn't that him becoming who he was? And I would say, yes, it is. But it's still a process of significant transformation that allowed him ownership. He didn't own much before, but he began to feel what it means to have ownership. And it's only ownership that allows you to feel proper responsibility for other people. What do you mean by consumerist stoicism? I mean stoicism that is problematic not because of the faults with stoicism, which are very significant indeed, but because it's stoicism refracted through the algorithm of Instagram rather than through some kind of estimation of what bits of it are useful to us now. Let's have a look. I've always wondered how I'd explain why it's only some people who get drawn into post-truth populism. Many are disadvantaged and isolated, but still don't. I think that when certain political positions are largely produced by various social forces, what these social forces do is make sure that at least some of the population are to be found in a particular position. They're never going to put all of the population there or even most of the population there. So that's generally what it means for social forces to inflect, if you like, conscious political commitments. Now, why does this genuine conflict in our society between political agency and truth gather up some people but not others? What's the difference, is what you're asking. And that's a very complex conversation. Of course, it's going to be true that the people who don't fall for it are somehow better positioned to withstand the pulls and pushes of these political forces. But it's also important not to underestimate that, not to overestimate that, I beg your pardon. In other words, is there more delusion in an average Trump voter than an average Democrat voter? Yes. But by how much is a question that would have a disturbing answer. In other words, there is an enormous amount of delusion in the Democrat voter. And just earlier on in this live, I pointed out one way in which there is a certain kind of epistemic superiority to Trump voters over you. And that's because, and it's unfair because actually it's not really you bombarded by criticisms, at least from me, maybe from others too, about technocratic centrist politics. But certainly, what a lot of Trump voters see is that something has gone very wrong, and then it can't go on like that anymore. And in many ways, that's more delusional, together with all the other stuff it comes with. But in other ways, it's less delusional than an average article in the Atlantic that says, "Hey guys, let's go back to normal," and hopefully Trump voters will just snap out of their irrationality and moral malignity. That position is not less irrational and delusional and conspiratorial than the Trumpist position. So the degree of conspiratorial evasion of reality among centrist political voters, among us, among people who watch the rest as politics, is massive. And in some ways, it is greater than the degree of delusion of Trump voters. It's just that in more degrees than not, it's lesser. And we're less delusional. But we are more delusional in some respects. So we've also got to have a humility about the social conditions in which we find ourselves, because it's not as though we're all doing perfectly with our epistemics and the Trump voters are all doing worse in every single respect. They're not. That's the beginning of that conversation. It has to be a conversation that really hits Trumpism hard, that doesn't fail to call out all of the ways in which Trumpism is a malevolent force in human history. But it also has to be a story that encourages us to be self-critical about both our blind spots and the deleterious consequences of the policies of governments from Clinton to Obama, for which many of you here voted. Hey Vlad, do you think it's detrimental for Ukraine to gamify its military, allocating resources based on number of kills? So I know the story. I'm not sure I'm qualified to assess it, to be honest. I disagree with Vlad that the majority of people in Russia are apolitical. They are political in the act of delegating all the decisions to the government. Back in 2022, a lot of cars were written with Z stickers. False, false. There weren't that many. I think you have captured an account of depoliticization, and you just called it politicization. Russians outsource politics to Putin. They don't have substantive views in favor or against the war. That's a very radically depoliticized position. I don't know what the guy in power is doing, but he seems to be running the territory I live on. I'm going to outsource politics to him and get on with my private life. Right? So, sorry, I'm being mean, but you've captured depoliticization and called it political, and you've made a false empirical claim about Z stickers. They're disgusting. and there's all kinds of crap on Russian cars about how they're going to take Berlin. One of these common lines was "Можем повторить," we can repeat it, the Second World War. But these were not that frequent. It was still a if you bought into the Western delusion that 70% of Russians positively support Putin in the war, you'd be shocked by how little of that stuff there was. But little is still far too much. And as you know, I do actually think that the Z symbol has some connections with another symbol from the middle of the 20th century. And that the people who have been using the Z symbol are aware of that in many cases and delight in it, right? So it's a very, very disgusting symbol. Hey, Vlad, one of the observations you've made that's been good is that Putin speaks with vitriol and spite in his voice when he speaks about the war. And to be honest, about most other things too. He speaks in a way that would strike us as comical if he's tried it in English. It's a sort of fabricated alpha masculinity, which Putin doesn't own. Notice how Putin presented himself on the morning after the Prigozhin mutiny began. He looked like a baby, hoping that someone somewhere would do something. It wasn't very, whatever useless terms the manosphere has got these days. It wasn't very that at all. And we have, by the way, we talked about this when we discussed this soldier who threatened the mutiny, Mr. Lunin, or whatever his name is. We talked about the fact that it's 3 years since the anniversary of it's a 3-year anniversary of the Prigozhin mutiny. And the shadow of Prigozhin still floats above Russia's political scene. And one of the thoughts that's available to us is that Prigozhin might still have a say in getting rid of Putin in the future. What Prigozhin missed, of course, was a positive program for change, especially for the institutions that might have looked to him for such a program, like the military. He just offered critique. If he'd offered more than critique, he would have had a greater chance of destabilizing the regime. But do not misunderstand the fact that in terms of a kind of a force in Russian politics, Prigozhin is still present. Posthumously, he could play a big role. Vlad, you once said that seeing someone's personal growth could make you shed a tear. Does this include Zelensky? In terms of the growth he had in the opening couple of weeks of the war, it could. It didn't, but it could have. Yeah. It's not a bad example. He developed very, very, very rapidly over a period of a couple of weeks. Vlad, greetings from the US. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you so much for being with me. You know what I wouldn't mind? I wouldn't mind if the comments here could be longer. I don't know what the word limit is, but I think if people are struggling, they're having to break up, right? Having to break up your stuff into two parts. Hi, Vlad. Kleptomanics is the depoliticization in Russia and reverence and outsourcing of accountability more bound to the office of the presidency and its perceived continued legitimacy, or Putin as a person himself? Putin as a person himself. Putin is a monarch, right? And indeed, there was a question above. Why does Russia keep, and then maybe I missed it, I don't know where it is now. Why does Russia keep having elections if it's an authoritarian regime? And why do people vote if they know it's an authoritarian regime? So just Google Greg Udin for an explanation of this. Russia is a sort of classic example of a plebiscital monarchy. And there's a tradition of reflection on that as a historical phenomenon going back to 19th century France and Napoleon III, and this would be talked about as plebiscital Caesarism. So the vote is an absolutely essential part of the regime's picture of its legitimacy, because the regime has to say the people are with us. It has to say that to the people. It has to say that to its potential opponents. It has to say that to its insiders. And so this is a monarchy that is dependent for its perceived legitimacy on an image of sort of intermittent universal acclamation from the population. Echelon, what do you do if you miss or ignore a question? Number one, ask it twice. Better ask it as a super chat. Email, get in touch with Vlad 3 times every 30 days if it's really important for you. And I might answer your question or put it into a thing, into a Q&A. Or fourth, if you can afford it, get a consultation with me if your question is big and detailed. So these are your stages of escalation. Synesthesis, you're talking about the grievances toward Ukrainians in Poland. We've seen a couple of really ugly social media videos about this. You say this is disheartening. I agree. Richard, great question. I might steal the question and see if I can do a chat about it, actually. There we go. Yeah, I'm keen to steal your question. Is our authoritarianism more like Huxley's Brave New World or Orwell's 1984, or neither? Watch this space. I think it's a nice topic. Hey Vlad, I'm a psychology student about to start internship in a big rehab center in my hometown in Ukraine. Any advice on preserving mental health while witnessing suffering? Buffers. And the understanding that there is no standard that you have to meet for what you can or can't tolerate. The standard is personal to every person. We all have things that we find more difficult or easier. So you've got to listen to yourself. You can't tell yourself a narrative and say, oh, I can tolerate that level of exposure to really challenging things head on. And that's the expectation I have of myself. And that's where I'm at. No, you've got to listen to yourself. You've also got to listen to your body. That might mean some buffers, extra buffers, more sleep, more meditation, some little indulgences that keep your nervous system regulated, but also give you the possibility to say, whoa, 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 this is getting, the waters are too deep for me. I need to slow down here. So it's personal to you. There's no external expectation of what your mind and body should tolerate that you've got to meet. You've got to listen to yourself. And if you feel you're going under, if you are listening to yourself, you'll be able to notice that 2 or 3 months ahead. Does the office of the presidency in Russia carry the continuity of the monarchy? No, it doesn't. There's nobody you can put in who would have that perceived legitimacy post Putin if it's not Putin. So it's Putin. And Putin thinks that too. By the way, he thinks he is Russia to a good extent. In other words, he thinks in this Wagnerian sense that his fate is intertwined with the fate of the Russian people. How much does the Great Patriotic War myth contribute to the depoliticization in Russia? And did the depoliticization begin in the Soviet period, or is it purely a Putin tactic? My plan temporarily collapsed of doing a weekly main channel video, but I've just put together an outline of the points for the next main channel video, which is going to be about Russian fatalism and this so-called slavery gene that Russians are supposed to have. Of course, an incoherent concept, but it does refer to special kinds of cultural passivity, but also just extreme kinds of not very culturally particular passivity, just the kind of passivity we all have in this neoliberal and hyper neoliberal environment, but it's just in a more extreme form to be found in Russia. So I'll be saying a little bit about that there. The basic story with the Great Patriotic War is that the myth about it in the Soviet period was a myth. Notice how nearly all of the main ways of celebrating it didn't arise immediately after it, but later, right? Even the famous Russian song that Kobzon sings, Victory Day, is from the 70s, even though it's a song that all Russians associate with victory in World War II. So there's a lot of myth and construction there. And then two things happen under Putin. One, the mythologization of the Second World War radically accelerates. But two, there's a kind of evacuation of historical and ideological content to it. In other words, there's a particular ideological projection that the Soviet Union attached to the Second World War. Putin doesn't do that. Putin evacuates the Second World War of any particular meaning and treats it as a cipher. It becomes a sort of a post-truth canvas onto which anything can be projected. And that's especially true with the personage of Stalin himself. Stalin is increasingly important in the minds of too many Russians, but is not important as the historical Stalin or as a false version of the historical Stalin. He is important as a cipher onto which people project different things. And that's what cleverly Putin's propaganda has encouraged. What's your opinion of Adam too? Presumably, well, I think it's a positive opinion. I haven't followed him closely in recent times, but a positive opinion. Vlad, will Putin do a big provocation in the Baltics soon? Go back to earlier in the live where we talked about it. Rach is saying parade in Red Square wasn't really a thing before Brezhnev, by which point most of the broken veterans had expired. That's right. I think there was a kind of a frequency of this parade happening once every few years, and it was Putin who made it annual. What are Putin's thoughts about Russia's dependency on China? Isn't Russia going to be the biggest victim of Putin's so-called multipolar world? Many people in Putin's regime are not impressed by Russia's dependence on China. Putin's relationship with it is, what do you expect me to do? His relationship with Russia's dependence on China is similar to his relationship with Russia's economic crisis. What do you expect me to do? This is just a consequence of things we've been forced into doing. And so we're doing these things, and these are the consequences. What do you think will happen to Belarus in the coming years? Well, Belarus has this extraordinary tragic history with this 2020 extraordinary public mobilization that didn't succeed. Unfortunately, Belarus's fate is tied to Russia's fate. Belarusian freedom is dependent on the collapse of the Putin regime under most conceivable circumstances. How important is masculinity in Russian culture, and how does it affect the war? Masculinity is very important in Russian culture, whereas in the West there's a crisis of masculinity. Men don't know what they are. Far too many men. Men don't know what it means to be masculine men. Men in Russia think they all too readily know what it means to be masculine men. So men in Russia have this sort of Disneyfied, very superficial conception of masculinity. And that's why Putin can get away with sort of scowling and grinding his teeth in public without looking embarrassing, because it's effectively a sort of 13-year-old's conception of masculinity. So that's a rough difference. How does it affect the war? Well, certain kinds of very, very toxic evasions of healthy masculinity are, of course, expressed in the Z sphere, where people go on about how Russia is going to beat everybody up, even though it's not doing very well. So that's a kind of a sort of a ludicrous side for this kind of bogus affirmation of male virility. Whereas in fact, Russian men are actually very, very fearful. They're very, very fearful of any homosexuality they find in themselves. They're very scared. They're on the run from their own homosexuality. And Russian men are also tendentiously on the run from feeling attuned to their feminine side, which is a strong precondition of actually being able to express your masculine side well. So there's a lot of repression there. Somebody's saying UFC fight in the Kremlin. The biggest threat, Decisive is saying, emerging from the Second World War were nukes. How ready do you think the world is for the emergence of drone technology, particularly low cost availability, to be used by non-state groups? I'm going to say that is outside of my ballpark. I think you'd want people with some kind of understanding of weaponry, some kind of understanding of security. I could tell you some things about it. I'm not sure I could tell you things that you don't already know. KBMW. Mark Galeotti mentioned that Putin could mobilize new soldiers or use current conscripts to immediately boost soldier numbers. Your thoughts on whether Putin will do this? We briefly mentioned this above. They are thinking about this inside the regime. Putin is thinking about it. Putin does not want to do it. Would doing a second big wave of mobilization, which is different to sending in the current conscripts, um, destroy the Putin regime? Probably not. Would sending in the conscripts destroy the Putin regime? Probably not. I think Putin has in him one more big mobilization wave of some kind, but it will be even harder than the first one. So his best idea is to avoid it or to do it incrementally by stealth. And dress it up in various kinds of ways. For instance, say that it's just a way of rotating people on the front. We're going to have the same number. We're just going to bring the people back who are there and send in new ones. And then he does that without bringing the people back. So Putin is very, very, very reluctant to do mobilization. If I were to guess, his thought about it today is I'm open to doing it if it needs to be done, but for now, my position is that I'm not going to do it, but I'm going to keep reassessing that week by week. So that would be my rough guess of where Putin is at. I found that the people that display sympathies for Russia's actions share a similar psychology to the Kremlin, blaming everything bad on the world but never take responsibility for themselves' opinion. I tend to think that it's hard to generalize. I think that a lot of people in the West who support Russia don't really support Russia. They're just making a pro Russian gambit within the context of local culture wars. I mean, if you ask a lot of the so called Russia fanciers in the Western culture wars what Putin's war is about, what Putin is about, what he's trying to achieve, they fall apart very rapidly. So it's a sort of a mobilization of this conflict on the ex-Soviet space for the purposes of local culture war maneuvers. Then there is, of course, another demographic that supports the war, and that's certain kinds of imperialistic Russians in Russia. Then there are the depoliticized Russians who neither oppose nor support the war. And then there are the very, 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 very small number of people like followers of Dugin in the West, for instance. We made a video about that actually on the Philosophy channel. It's called "Can Anybody Reasonable Argue That Putin's War is a Good Idea?" And there the argument would be that you can paint some kind of very elaborate account of multipolarity, which is generally beneficial to the world and is advanced somehow by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that invasion in that context is seen as a kind of counter pressure against certain kinds of excessive Western domination. Is it really a question of winning or who is losing slower? Well, we mentioned Mark Galeotti above. Mark says that both sides are losing, but one's going to be losing slower than the other. And I think that's the right way to capture it. And that's the problem with all the things we say about how badly Russia is doing in many respects and how badly Ukraine is doing in many respects. These are meaningless judgments if they're judgments about the war, unless they're relativized to one another, right? If I can't stand up and I'm in a wheelchair, I'm losing if you can stand, but I'm winning if you can't even get into a wheelchair and I can for a bit. So unless you introduce that relativity, you're not going to be able to judge who is doing better and worse in the war. And unfortunately, for different reasons, what I find happens is we talk about the strengths and weaknesses of Ukraine and the strengths and weaknesses of Russia separately without integrating them. And to the person who is just immersed in that one conversation or the other conversation, it's just very difficult to know how to put it into the right context. Let's go for a couple of more questions. Zong, hey Vlad, you say that treating immigration as a settled debate broke trust, but isn't we just need to explain the benefits the same move, assuming the public's no is ignorance and not a real choice? I'm not suggesting that you assume that the public's choice is ignorance. No. So currently in the UK, non-legal immigration is much higher than I would argue you can get civic consent for, and legal immigration is much higher, although in a way he didn't champion enough. Keir Starmer did get the numbers down. Legal immigration is also way higher than you can get legal consent for. My proposal is not to say, oh, you morons, we'll just persuade you and then you'll agree that we need more people to come in. No, what I'm saying is you don't treat people as making intellectual mistake. You treat people as taking a reasonable political stance. That's in terms of certain values, like feeling that their country's, got a door that it can open and close rather than just being, somewhere in the field without a door, without a wall, without a roof, which is not very good for the country's chances of sustaining its democracy. So what you say is, hey, how do you feel about it? I feel like that about it. All right. Well, how about these arguments for a certain amount of immigration? No, don't accept them. Well, let me make them again. Let me try. If you can get the civic consent, then you do the policy at that particular level. If you don't, you try to bring the policy down in alignment with consent. What you can't say is that it's ignorance because it's politics. It's not intellectual argument. You can't assemble a bunch of experts and say that's the immigration number we need to run our health service and to grow our economy. No, this is democracy. This is undemocratic technocracy to say our experts have figured it out, right? And so no, it's not ignorance. It's saying that yes, people have many different sides to which we can appeal to try to move them and persuade them, but we're not educating them when we do that. Although there could be a little bit of that. What we are basically doing is just engaging in political discourse and seeing if we can shift where the current level of civic consent is. But what I am saying is, if you have your immigration policy massively out of sync with civic consent for a long time, you're just going to collapse your democracy. Would the world actually be a better place if Putin were gone tomorrow? Ashley Carvel is asking. It could be worse, but if you asked me to gamble on it, I would refer you back to the conversation we had at the beginning, where I claimed that no member of Putin's Security Council in 2022 would have started a full-scale attack on Ukraine. So therefore, yes, it could be worse after Putin. We could all end up in a global nuclear exchange with some crazy person in charge of Russia. But if you said Putin could be sent to permanently live in Tonga tomorrow and spend his days fishing and owning pigs, would you take that, Vlad, for the world? I would say an instant yes, right? So it would be a gamble, but it would be a gamble well worth going for, right? It wouldn't come with guarantees, but nothing comes with guarantees. And indeed, in history, you see often doing the right thing leads to the wrong conclusion, right? very often doing the right thing can lead to an absolute disaster. You can have two options as a country, the wrong one and the right one. You can take the right one and destroy your country. That's history. So that kind of contingency you've got to understand. We over-moralize this, right? Is Crimea a more valuable symbol for Ukraine to deoccupy? Yes, it's an enormously valuable symbol, but don't assume that Russia can be deoccupied, that Crimea can be deoccupied realistically by Ukraine. It can be cut off, but deoccupied is different. To understand just how deep Russia's myths about Crimea are, watch my video on the main channel, Why Putin Can't Afford to Lose Crimea, maybe from 2 or 3 years ago. If you click most watched videos on the main channel, it should be kind of in the top 5 or 6, I think. It's got about 600,000 views. Why would you wish such evil on the wonderful people of Tonga? They wouldn't notice. They'd just keep on having their siestas and having their feasts and drinking kava. I'm teasing. They wouldn't notice. But it's fascinating. I mean, I caught Tonga 20 years ago when it was still much more close to the West. So I'd expect it to be much closer to something like Vanuatu now than it was back then. Decisive says, Ricky is from Tonga and my 2 pigs are from Tonga. My pig, Ruby, who is a boy, is from Tonga, and my main pig, Hillary, who's black with a white spot, is from Tonga. But she didn't come back with me when I left. She went to live on an island. Let's do 2 more questions. Shadow Guy, greetings to you in Switzerland. Enumerations. Who's going to win the World Cup? Wow. There is no doubt about who has the most, and I still haven't watched the full match, by the way. There is no doubt about who has the most potent attack, and that's clearly France. France's front 3 are strong, and France's second front 3 are stronger than most other people's front 3. And a player who has been, in fact, in very intermittent form this season, Dembele, has, in fact, caught form at just about the right time. So it's very hard to not think of France as favorites. And it's very hard to not think of Spain as also not being far behind. And then you go down to a whole group of other countries, probably led by Argentina. They're the most coherent and well-drilled team. And so I'd put them third, or I'd put them in the top 3 together with France, Spain, and Spain. So we've got a top 2 or a top 1 or a top 3. And however you arrange it, I think that would be Argentina, France, and Spain. And then you've got a group with a few other countries, and that includes England and Brazil. I have never supported England more than I support England in this World Cup, because we've got some, as Roy Keane absolutely hates this expression, got some really good lads in the squad. We've really got some absolutely wonderful characters. It's just my hope that the boys do not get too timid through feeling pressure and not enough resources for confidence. We've already seen a bit of that with the England team, but there's some wonderful, wonderful characters. Rice is wonderful. Bellingham is wonderful. Kane is wonderful. These are people who are hardworking, humble, confident, and curious. So it's the healthiest England squad probably for 30 years since Euro 96. Now, there were some tensions in that squad, but they were more to do with Paul Gascoigne misbehaving. So these are some of my thoughts. One of the things that I have enjoyed in the small bits that I've seen is, for the first time, how the weakest teams in the competition are relatively well drilled. We've seen extremely serious, high-level professional organization from the weakest teams and much less naivety. You go back 20 or 30 years, you often see spectacular tactical and psychological naivety from the weakest teams. But it's not the case, right? You turn on the screen and Iraq are really well tactically drilled and extremely well prepared. Right? Okay, Vlad, stop. This is not a football channel. You can start a football channel. You've got a health condition. You can't have as many channels as you want. You cannot start a football channel. Let me just say that at the beginning of this live, I didn't know where my health would go, whether it would drift toward the stabilization or deterioration, and fingers crossed it drifted a little bit more toward the stabilization, which is why we've been here an hour and a half. Soren, great question about the Russian opposition. I'm sure I'm going to do an update about them, but it's a mess. Also, I'd recommend you to distinguish different members of it. Some of them are broadcasters and sort of publicists aiming at a Russian audience, but somebody like Kasparov mainly addresses a Western audience these days. I wouldn't call him a member of the Russian opposition. In fact, his main role, even though he does a lot of the Russian stuff, his main role is basically like a Western Trump critic. He's a guy who says a lot of really incisive things on Twitter about the flaws with Trump. Vlad is forgetting that Argentina may have to face Australia. Oh, I'm sorry. I am sorry. I guess, John, I'm sorry. I do think that Germany's underestimated. So a lot of people wouldn't even put Germany into that second group with Brazil and England, and I absolutely would. Germany are capable of beating anybody. So there we go. And they have had a really successful run up to the World Cup, and they are on the whole underestimated. And also people are not very impressed by the general prospect of Kai Havertz up front, but it's actually surprisingly effective. And we know that because this is a guy who scored a Champions League winning goal before he went to Arsenal. Vlad, can you make more China content? No, because my background is that I'm a political philosopher, but I grew up in the Soviet Union. I have followed Russian politics closely since the 90s. I have notes on Putin going back to the 90s. I have spoken about Russian politics, interacted with the different leading experts on it for 30 years. I have, until my health stopped allowing it, periodically gone back to Russia to get a taste of things. Through the 2010s, I still did that. So if I dedicated 3 months to learning about China, I would get to the level at which the people who you mostly watch talk about Russia are at on YouTube. But that would not be even within 1,000th of my knowledge of Russia. So it'd be completely unethical toward you. I could get away with it. In fact, I could grow a China channel really well if I started one tomorrow, but it'd be completely unethical. And it'd be unethical because I'd be straight away outclassed as soon as I ran into a China expert. Whereas if I run into the leading one or two experts on Russia, because I am not a country expert, I'm really a political philosopher who happens to know a lot about a couple of places in the world. They'd know a lot of things I don't. But even when it comes to Russia, the leading Russia expert will still take some things from me, right? And I could never achieve that with China in my lifetime. It would be completely unethical to do that. So that's why I can, at a stretch, comment on Russia-China relations from the Russian side, but that's about it. My partner, who is a professional journalist, speaks Mandarin, has lived in China. So if I started talking about China, she'd kick me out straight away. And she mocks Western commentators and journalists and historians who spend 2 weeks in China and then think they know about it. So that's why this is an ethical matter. If you wake me up in the middle of the night and make me talk about Russia to the best 5 Russia experts in the world, it'd be a very fruitful conversation. If you do that with China, I'd be completely out of my depth, and there'd be no point in me doing anything other than taking notes. So that's the difference, right? You're getting a really weirdly high quality sort of hybrid product here. A political philosopher is talking about a particular country. But I can't give you that hybrid product with China. It would be deeply unethical. So I'm afraid that's the answer. So I often get messages, can you please do with Xi what you've done with Putin? And the answer is, I talk about Xi a lot. So I talk and read and ask about China much more than you would guess, given what I say in public. But it's often me asking and listening, and it's not my area of expertise. Now, you've got to know about it, but I am privileged that I am not Rory and Alistair. Rory and Alistair, and I love this about them, some people knock them for it, but I love Rory and Alistair from The Rest is Politics for the way they talk about all the world. And I especially love it when they talk about small parts of the world, because they really elevate them. It's wonderful when they talk about some small island country. The trouble is with the format they have, Rory knows an extraordinary amount about the Middle East. Alistair knows a lot about the UK, Germany, France. But they don't know much about Russia. They don't know much about China, but they have to talk about it. And I think they should. But that obviously comes with certain risks that, I actually had a fight about this with my partner, who is a journalist. She's been a little bit critical of how they've talked about China and the rest is politics, not for particular things they've said, but for just talking without knowing enough. And I haven't. I have said, no, they've got to do it because they've got to, as it were, try to include the world for the benefit of their audience. But I think while I want to say that I'm right, I do think my partner has a point insofar as she says there is expertise and there is expertise. So, and I would need to go to China as well for that, right? So, what these days makes you most proud of the country of England? Oh, England specifically. I think a lot of it will be Britain. Well, I'm proud of our football team, but more viscerally, it's going to be obviously people, right? There's lots of amazing people. I also feel, I feel very tragically debilitated. I can't really go outside safely because of the verticalization that's required in my wheelchair. I've been out 3 times of my build for a trip within the city in 2026. All 3 were to concerts, funnily enough. Should have been to medical appointments, it was to concerts. But putting aside my health issue, I love the area where I'm at, and all of this stuff about how London is a post-apocalyptic scene pushed by Musk and others is partly true in some ways, but mostly false. So, if I could travel by wheelchair, I'd love to walk. But if I could travel by wheelchair to see, I don't know, a friend across another part of East London, would I take a wheelchair trip? That's 20 minutes through dark alleys in London at midnight. Yeah, easily, like without even thinking about it. So, what I would say is that London is a slightly less European city than it was before Brexit, and I feel it. So 10 Germans, and suddenly 7 of them are gone. They're in Munich now, or in Berlin. So it's become clearly less European city, but it's still a very wonderful multicultural city. You see, I'm sliding. I'm talking about being a Londoner. But it would be interaction with decent, hardworking, kind folks in different parts of the country. That'll be part of it. I'm very proud of, although I think there are huge downsides to it, but I'm very proud of the empirical tradition in this country. I'm very proud of the tradition of parliamentary democracy. Our institutions are way stronger than in most European countries, even though they're getting weaker. One of the things I love about parts of London is the complete absence of aesthetic racism. In much of the West, in much of the European West, where there is an absence of ethical racism, there's still a presence of aesthetic racism. And there are parts of London that are so deeply multicultural that there is an absence of aesthetic racism, and that's wonderful. So there's quite a lot there. There's also an openness and a receptivity to eccentricity in the UK. In that sense, we're the opposite to France. In France, you have to do the script. And Adam Ragusi is in the house. I wonder what you think about this, Adam. Going back to when I felt better, I found some things pathological about a lot of not the French cuisine, but a lot of the French performances of the French cuisine. In other words, you're doing something because it is the right way to do that thing, not because it's you doing it authentically. So whereas in some of the most promising places in London, what you would experience on the plate would often be aspiration and insecurity, striving, but not being confident. And what you'd have on the plate in Paris would often be a kind of depersonalized perfection. this is the way to do that, and here is us doing it. But the question is, are you actually a person? Are you anything? Or you just produce this according to the cultural script? And so there's all kinds of pathology we have that the French don't have. But one thing we do have is a certain kind of receptivity to genuinely individual and authentic endeavor. Now, I have a lot of critical things to say about this country culturally, but there we go. Generalists need humility, Adam Ragusi is saying, but they're also valuable. Someone needs to try to look at the whole board, that folks like Rory and Alistair. Yeah, Ian Bremmer recently got in real trouble among Russia experts for saying something slightly banal, and you'd think I'd be keen to dig him because he's speaking a little bit out of his depth. And I didn't think that what he said went that much wrong, really. What I'd also say is that we don't just need generalists, we need both more academic experts, but we also need experts like the Mooch, for example, whose expertise is actually about seeing patterns and making certain intuitive judgments on the basis of experience. Often neurodiverse people are better at that. Not always, but often. And we need that too. And what I don't like is when academics come along and say, yeah, great, the Mooch is fine, but let's talk to real experts on America. No. We need to get what Trump is all about, right? Two wonderful, absolutely amazing folks, Russia experts, did a joint piece in Foreign Affairs recently, which I warmly recommend. In fact, I'm going to find it for you. It's about how Putin is structurally caught up in needing to perpetuate the war. Not sure links work here. Oh, they do. So it's a piece by Sevagunitsky and Jeremy Morris. Jeremy Morris is one of the people in the world with the best social understanding of Russia. Martin, yes, and the Mooch thinks that about himself too. But as I'm not saying anything private. I'm saying something public that he said in public. So Jeremy and Seva had a line in the piece, which I know who put it in. It's Jeremy who put it in. And the line was, "We spent too much time talking about Putin." And that was, amidst the brilliant piece, a slightly defensive and insecure line that I didn't get impressed by, because I felt it was knocking precisely the sort of thing we just attributed to the Mooch. And I'm sorry, but the Mooch's capacity to talk about some of the biggest things affecting our lives is outstanding. And I'm not going to have that knocked. Even though I come from an academic background, I'm not going to have that knocked. I think that's really important. There are almost these kind of two types of expertise. There is an academic adjacent expertise, but there are other kinds of expertise. We need people whose expertise is not academic, but who are very good at using their experience and also observing various patterns. You see, what I don't like about that line, we don't need to talk about Putin, is that it's too open to the objection. Is that because you don't feel confident making generalizations about him, right? Well, what do you have to say to me? Are you going to say, hey, Vlad, what you think you can observe about Putin is in fact just a series of projections? That's what you'd have to say. And I don't think that's plausible. because you'd really then have to say that people's observations about Putin, whoever they are equally valid. And I don't think that's remotely true. So, I wonder if food replaced Catholicism in post-revolutionary France. I'd really love to understand your thoughts about my thoughts about France's relationship with performing its cuisine. And of course, when we make these generalizations, it's going to be precisely the case that so many people who are going to be completely free from these generalizations applying to them are going to be French. So what we're always talking about is something tendentious, right? We're not talking about something that literally just captures everybody. In fact, very often what a cultural observation will be is really the point that 20% of people in a certain country are very caught up in a certain pattern, whereas 35% are in another. And then we say that other country is the country that does that pattern, and the first country is the country that doesn't. So these are, of course, judgments of degree that recognize that while it's true that in a certain sense your cultural environment applies to you if you're in that culture, which means it applies to everybody in the culture. It's also, of course, the case that these are very fine washes and gradations about which we have to be careful. And very often, the very best critics of particular cultures actually come from that culture, right? I mean, notice how difficult the ethical sort of morass Israel has sunk into is, but who are some of the most articulate people about what's wrong in Israel? A lot of them are Israelis. And so I sound obviously more essentialist than I am when I generalize about cultures. All right, beautiful community, we're going to stop. Thank you very, very much for your excellent questions today. And thank you very much for getting my health through this 2-hour live. And if you're boycotting the World Cup for ethical reasons, good on you. If you're watching it, then good luck to your team. Thank you very much, everybody. And thank you so much, Amalfitano, as always. Bye-bye.